Now I'm pleased to introduce today's presenters. Jenny Irons is a senior program officer at the William T. Grant Foundation, where she leads the Institutional Challenge Grant Program and the Major Grants Funding Initiative to support research on reducing inequality among youth. And Alicia Sasser-Modestino is an associate professor with appointments in the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs and the Department of Economics at Northeastern University, where she also serves as the research director of the Dukakis Center for Urban and Regional Policy.
At the William T. Grant Foundation, we believe public and private universities have a critical role to play in not only producing high-quality research, but also in supporting research that solves pressing societal problems. We also believe, based on research we funded over the years, that university and community partnerships have the potential to make this sort of difference. The Institutional Challenge Grant was designed to bridge the gap between research produced and research being used and has four major goals. The first goal of this grant is to support research institutions in building a sustained partnership with a public agency or nonprofit organization. The research practice partnership should have defined objectives, roles, and agreements, and should be built for the long term. So this isn't just about funding one-off projects, but about long-term institutional commitments with joint research agendas that are mutually defined and mutually beneficial. The second major goal of this grant is that together the partnership will pursue a joint research agenda to reduce inequality in youth outcomes. The third goal is this goal of institutional change. In this part of this goal, what we ask of our applicants is that the research institution commits to a feasible strategy for institutional change that can address the structural, motivational, and/or financial barriers that often inhibit research practice partnerships. The final goal of this grant is to, on the research design, give researchers new experiences that foster deeper understandings of a given policy or practice context and the skills required to serve as effective partners. This is an ambitious challenge, it's a lot of work, but we believe it's what's needed to produce and use relevant research in ways that improve youth outcomes.
I'm going to talk today about our specific project that we got funded called Building a More Holistic and Inclusive Workforce Development System for Boston's Youth. This is joint work with my policy partner, Rashad Cope, who at the time was the Director of Youth Engagement and Employment, but now is the Deputy Director of the City of Boston's new Worker Empowerment Cabinet. Our policy partner came to us and said, help us design, some new tracks of programming because the usual summer jobs were not available. And we took all of that research evidence and those four new tracks of programming, brought it to Mayor Walsh at the time, and he invested $4 million of CARES Act funding that summer to commit to hiring the same number of youth at the same rate of pay for the same number of hours. And now that work is ongoing in a new partnership that's being funded by the Institutional Challenge Grant, where we've just spent a planning year with our policy partner to look under the hood at the Summer Youth Employment Program and now move the needle on what that program does. On the institutional change side, the goal is really, how do we institutionalize this kind of infrastructure across the university, right? So the Institutional Challenge Grant was like a breath of fresh air for me as a researcher to finally have the resources to be able to engage in the partnership in a very structured way, to make sure that my policy partner had the resources that they need. And so we had three sort of main goals when we set this up. One was to increase coordination. The second was to expand the capacity for faculty to be able to do this. And then finally, establishing the right incentives. The Institutional Challenge Grant is so important in the way it's blending the production of research with making use of research evidence, right? So it's really taking, as Jenny was saying, those two components and putting them together in this integrative way, that's probably very attractive in terms of a HIBAR kind of approach, where I think we're learning a lot about how to do these practice research practice partnerships because we're inside one while we're studying it and trying to get other people to do it. And so I just think that it's a really amazing opportunity to be able to blend those two things together.
In short, our hope is that this program catalyzes institutional change to better value research practice partnerships in their work. Now, one thing I will note is that a number of our grantees, when they apply, they're applying to really change the policies and practices in their particular school. So, for example, in a school of education or in the School of Public Policy. But what we're hoping will happen is that by really targeting change in a particular area of the university and demonstrating how effective that can be, we start to see those commitments diffuse across universities and also diffuse, hopefully, across other institutions as well.
What are the levers inside your institution that you can push, right? So I very deliberately, when we got the Institutional Challenge Grant, went around and started presenting this to any of the external constituents that I thought would be able to help me advance this cause. And that's how I ran into the Provost's director of strategy. And he said, oh, this sounds just like the academic plan. You've got to pitch this to the provost. Our senior leadership really wanted to make societal impact. They still were thinking about finding the cure for cancer or the next AI thing, not so much like how do you fix the summer youth employment program. And so we had to really teach them what societal impact looks like when you're handling these big kinds of amorphous problems that are intractable, that aren't going to get easily solved. One of the major barriers that we've identified is that there's a lot that happens upfront before you can even go and apply for external funding, right? So you need to get the right people at the table. You need to gain trust. You need to co-develop an ethical relationship. So we're not talking about when academics fly in, extract data from a community, write a peer-reviewed article, write that one paragraph at the end of a policy recommendation and fly out. That does not help anybody. That is not an ethical relationship. Really learning about policy needs before you launch the project or even seek external funding. So listening, right, which is not always a fundamental academic skill. Actually, we've been using both internal as well as external resources for training. So externally, we've been using the Scholar Strategy Network training, which has been very useful in terms of thinking about how to even approach policymakers, how do you talk to policymakers. There's also internally, we have a training called Runway to Broader Impacts that's funded by the National Science Foundation. And so this training is actually bringing in faculty from engineering, from the College of Science, to be thinking about the societal impacts by actually talking to people. It's a wild idea. So there are a lot of resources, but I do think a key part of this is that there has to be coaching. You can't just give someone a training and then leave them on their own, because there's lots of pitfalls. There's lots of things that change and moving parts with this work that really comes from just the experience. And so that's why SSN, Scholar Strategy Network, now has a coaching component to it. So we're going to have them coach our policy fellows, but also, again, that multi-generational team to have an experienced researcher working alongside with a junior researcher to really coach them through how these interactions look, I think is key.
And I will also too echo what Alicia said about the coaching for thinking about building relationships and capacity building. The Scholar Strategy Network is a great organization at doing this. If you don't have a chapter at your campus, identify a local chapter or reach out to them about starting a chapter on your campus to support that work. And then I think there's a lot of work among a lot of these partners that goes into really figuring out how to work with administration and leadership to advance the work, and I think that some of our PIs find, especially when they're not currently in positions of leadership, that they're energized by the work that it requires to do this work at an institutional level, but also find that it requires a lot of time that they weren't necessarily planning to invest in. Alicia,
you have to give people time. And that's where that time with the course release and the summer stipend comes after you give them a little bit of seed funding to try to get this going. I think a key piece of this is really demonstrating your value as an academic. So I always endeavor to provide some data and analysis back to my partner, like, hey, share some data with me, and I'm going to tell you like 3 key facts maybe you didn't know about it that could be useful to you in the thing that you do. And then that starts that reciprocal relationship, but giving people then additional time and resources to be able to do that. This is not like have one meeting at the beginning, one at the middle, one at the end. This is really partnering in real time, like, meeting every 2 weeks or every 4 weeks or wherever it might be.